Well, we're going to turn to very, 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 very practical stuff from Phil's theological and biblical explanation on money. We're now going to become very, very practical and very hands-on and talk about some of the specific things that you, as a clergy person, deal with. You know, it is an area that I think is confusing. It's confusing for many clergy, if not all clergy, because money issues are complex. They're complex because of the nature of some of the tax law. They're just complex for a variety of reasons. We spoke a number of years ago out in Jackson Hole for a group of Presbyterian PCUSA clergy. And we were flying back out. And we flew out of the Jackson Hole Airport, which isn't much of an airport. It's kind of a small airport. And we had some books with us. I don't know why we took them or why we brought them back. We probably tried to sell them and didn't sell them all. So we maybe shipped them out. I don't know. Anyway, we came back with about 5 or 6 books. So Phil said, okay, I'll put them in my, we just didn't check luggage. We just carried on. So I'll put them in my suitcase. So we're going through, a very small airport, going through security. Clear, they're x-raying stuff. So the woman doing, the TSA agent doing the security screening pulled Phil aside. They were all in Phil's suitcase. And she said, I'm going to have to ask you to open your suitcase. I can't see through. There's something there, the x-ray isn't going through. So she opens it up, and it's all these books that he's got laid out. And she's like, what's up with these books? You've got a lot of them. And then she said, are you the author? And he said, yeah, coming back from a speaking thing, and these are books. And she says, well, what's it about? Ministry and money, what is that even about? And he said, well, I'm out here talking to a group of clergy, and we're trying to help them figure out ways to deal with money in their personal lives. And she said, well, my husband, he's a minister, and he doesn't have a clue about what to do with money. So Phil said, well, would he like a book? Because we're obviously taking 6 or 7 of these back. And she said, oh, that would be great. That would just be great. And Phil said, well, we could even autograph it for you. And she said, okay, but don't hand it to me. Go, just put it on the podium over there after you're done, and I'll go ahead and pass you through security. So we autographed it, left it on the podium, and left. So even the husbands of TSA agents need a little help with dealing with money. Well, we want to turn our attention then this afternoon, and I get a little nervous, especially after lunch, and especially when I talk about income tax, because it is such a complex area. There's 4 areas that we really want to look at, and Andy, I think, directed us to trying to take on some of these issues. I'm not seeing Andy right now, but I'm pretty sure he would agree to this. That this was some specific things he wanted us to cover with you today. Some of the more practical ends of things. So 4 areas that we've identified, and they're all in chapter 9 of the book here. Number 1, paying taxes. Number 2, how to structure the compensation package. Number 3, personal spending. And Phil talked a little bit about that already this morning, but I will get a little bit more practical. And then finally, number 4, personal giving, which Phil will come up and do a section on towards the end of our time. So I would like, I guess, just to start with, before I venture into the area of tax, because we'll take them one by one, I guess I would like to just have some sort of indication from you how comfortable you are. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I don't have a clue anything regarding tax, income tax, as a clergy person, all the way up to 10 saying I prepare my own return and I'm really pretty comfortable with it. Because I don't really have that sense. I mean, I know if I sit down with a group of brand new clergy people that it's all going to be 1. I don't have any idea. I mean, I may know how to do an individual income tax return, but I don't have any idea about the laws that are unique to clergy. But a lot of you have been in ministry for a long time, so I don't want to tell you things you already know. That's one thing as a teacher I've just tried to stay away from, is trying to teach you things that you already know. If you've got a way of already doing this that's legal and that's complies with law, then fine, keep going. So maybe if I could just kind of get an indication, how many of you feel relatively comfortable doing income tax? A lot of you. All right. How many of you feel lost and you really don't know? Okay, and there are some. So then that presents a quandary for me because I don't want to take time on something that you already feel pretty comfortable about. Yes?
What about those that know how to get in the car and drive it to the tax man?
Excellent. Excellent. What do you think about that? Is that good enough? Is that good enough? Yes. Well, let me go through real quickly and get to this. This is our advice. Do exactly what you just described. Find somebody that knows how to do not just income tax, but clergy income tax. So that's my first caveat to you. Can I get in the car and drive and find somebody that knows how to do my taxes? Yes, but make sure you find somebody that knows how to do your taxes, that knows how to do clergy tax. For a while, in one of the public accounting firms that I practiced in, they decided that having me around was maybe an angle to develop new business, because she's married to a clergy person and she knows how to do clergy income tax. So we started to actually try to actively recruit and develop new clergy income tax business. It's typically not a real appealing area for public accounting firms because, well, because it's complex and because, you know, it's hard to charge a whole lot, and, you know, I mean, you're not typically at the high end of the, you know, yeah. So, I mean, you know that. I don't have to tell you that. So I guess continue that story, that firm then, as we developed new business, as we started to bring in clergy that were interested in having their returns done by us, I think just about every return that came in as new business that had been prepared previously by another tax preparer had been done incorrectly. I can't think of very many that in my memory that were done right. So the clergy person had paid somebody the year before to do it, paid somebody they thought knew how to do it, but that individual didn't know how to do it. Yes?
In light of that, perhaps the fact that most of us feel very comfortable doesn't necessarily mean we know what we're talking about.
Well, it might. It might. And let me get to my third, I think, bullet point here. So find somebody who specializes. And here's the real reason, in addition to what you just mentioned. Even if you hire somebody, you're still responsible. I mean, that's an unpleasant thought, isn't it? That you've hired somebody and you've paid them to do it, but it still is your responsibility. You are obligated to know. It doesn't absolve you of responsibility and liability for your return. If they tell you you don't owe anything and you owe, and you don't pay it, I mean, you can try to pursue, and they may be willing to help you out some way, but you're the one that's got to pay the tax. It's your tax. So all that said, I guess I feel that, as a part of this program, I'd feel so delighted at the end of your 2 years if you felt comfortable, at least in understanding the basics. You don't necessarily, in fact, we advise you don't do your own tax return, but understand the basics. Because I think if you understand the basics that underpin all this crazy tax law that applies to clergy, it empowers you. It really does. You can then say, I'm not going to just be freaked out and give this stuff to somebody else to prepare and hope that they do it right. And meanwhile, I have no clue if it's right or wrong. No, you're empowered, and you can speak. When you speak with them, you can speak intelligently. So maybe let's cover some basics. And we won't get into the details very much. Well, I don't get into the details here. I mean, that's one of the first things I tell you in Chapter 9, is what's in here is not enough to help you prepare your taxes. It's just not. There are books that can help you. And if if that's something you love, you can get a book that's going to walk you through everything you'd ever want to know. And it's going to be much longer than our book. So not just a chapter, but an entire book. And you can do that. What we'll try to do then is just touch on some things. And I'm going to go fairly fast because I am assuming. Now, here's another thing. You're in groups. And I think that at almost every table in this room, there were hands raised of people who felt they understood and had a pretty good grip. And there were some hands raised at mostly every table of people who didn't understand. You're in groups. You're there to help one another. So maybe this is a great way for you, before you meet the next time, which I think is in April, after everybody's favorite day of the year, after April 15th. So maybe between now and April 15th, on your phone conversation, on your go-to-meeting conversations, you check in with each other. How are you doing? Have you found somebody to do your taxes? How do you feel about the way they're doing it? Do you feel a little more comfortable this year with what it is that's being put on that 1040 for you? Okay, is that a deal? Yes.
Could you comment a little bit about TurboTax and have you used that? Or
I do. Use it every year.
Do you like it for clergy, or
I think
should that be
it's,
a substitute?
I think it's pretty good. I usually have to kind of tweak it. And I know what it's supposed to see. I'm empowered by the knowledge. I know what the number should be. First thing I do is I do it by hand. Not all the lines, but I mean the pieces that I know what the Social Security tax should be on his compensation, because it's not me, it's him as a clergy person. I know what it ought to be. I know the magic number, and if it doesn't come out right, then I have to dig and tweak and finesse and massage to get it in there right. It's gotten much, much better, though. I don't know that I had to do a whole lot last year. I think it really was relatively straightforward. It's pretty advanced. Okay. How many of you do your own returns? A lot of you do. Wow, you are brave, brave people. I'm proud of you. I am. I think that's terrific. All right. Well, what we're wanting then to try to cover, if we go back here, let's just make sure you understand these three things, okay? The unique dual status of clergy. There's certain things that, we can't go any further until we get those firmly in our minds. Rules that apply to clergy with regard to housing, and then withholding rules. And I'm going to go kind of quickly. All this stuff, by the way, all these slides are incredibly detailed. And I've done that so that I could kind of condense Chapter 9 into a PowerPoint for you. So you've got a lot of it right there in kind of note form. So we're not going to go through them all, but you have access to those. All right, these, I'm sorry, I'm clicking ahead because that one we already looked at. All right, so just so we all know, what's the difference between Social Security and Social Security tax and federal income tax? We all know that, right? Okay, Social Security tax, Medicare tax funds the Social Security system. True? So it funds Medicare system. And how much is that tax? Way, your answer is way too much, right? Way too much, way too much. And why is it so much? Because what do you have to do as a clergy person? You have to do what? You do, you absolutely do. You have to pay your share and the employer's share. People that work for McDonald's and people that work for Walmart don't, right? If you work somewhere else, you don't. Yeah, your kids don't, your spouses don't. They have their employer pay 1/2, okay? So a portion of that tax is Social Security, and a portion of it's Medicare. 6.2 is Social Security, 1.45 is Medicare. Together it's 7.65. You're paying at twice that rate, so 15.2%, right? That's Social Security. It funds the Social Security system. What's federal income tax? It's completely different. Federal income tax is completely paid by you. What do we do with it? It provides revenue to operate the federal government and to bail out Wall Street fat cats. Who wrote that in there? I think at the time that I put this together, that was right around the time that there were major bailouts going on in Washington. That's right. I wouldn't do that anymore. Paid by employees, right? Completely. You pay it all. Nobody helps you with that. How much? Depends. Depends what you think. There is no 7.65 or 1.45, right? It depends on how much income you're going to have on your income tax return at the end of the year, right? Okay, so be sure you've got those two separate in your minds, right? What else? Are you self-employed or are you an employee? Ooh, you're so good. You should be up here teaching this. How do you know the answer to that? You're awesome. You're both. You are both. So for Social Security and Medicare portion, the Social Security and Medicare tax, what are you? You are self-employed by law. You are self-employed. What are you for federal income tax? Generally, you're an employee. And I say generally because there would be some leeway for certain denominations. There may be some denominations where you could get away being considered self-employed. What about that additional income? When you do a wedding, when you do a funeral, what's that? Self-employment income. So you've got all kinds of stuff going on in your return, don't you? You have, first of all, you have this thing called dual status. So you are both. You're both self-employed and you're an employee. That's weird. I mean, it's just weird, and I wish it wasn't that way, but it is, which makes it awful complex, doesn't it? All right. Any questions so far? All right, we're doing good. We're doing good. What about housing? Tax treatment of clergy housing. So churches typically give you how many parsonages and how many housing allowances in the room? How many parsonages? How many housing allowances? Mostly housing allowances. All right, so most churches are going to give one or the other, right? And all churches in the United Methodists are going to give one or the other. So some of you have housing allowances and some of you live in church-owned housing. Okay, good news. What's the good news with regard to housing? Why do we love it? How is it tax-free? Be more specific. Income tax-free. So good news, within limits, either a parsonage or a housing allowance is income tax-free. That's the good news. That's the good news, and I don't know if we'll do examples. Well, what would the example be? You have a $30,000 salary, and your church also gives you $1,000 a month to rent a house, $12,000 worth of housing. What are you taxed on? For federal income tax purposes, $30,000. You have a $30,000 salary and you live in a parsonage. The fair rental value of that parsonage is considered to be $1,000 a month, so you have $12,000 worth of value. What are you taxed on for income tax purposes? 30. So the answer is the same. Either way, 30,000 is your federal income tax liability. All right, then there's the bad news. What's the bad news? There you go. You guys are so good. The bad news is Social Security tax. And it's not just 1/2 of the Social Security tax, it's that double Social Security tax because you're self-employed. So you're going to pay far more Social Security tax, my guess is, and most of us do, especially when you're starting out in ministry. You're going to pay far more Social Security tax than you are going to pay federal income tax. How many of you is that true for? You pay more in Social Security tax than you pay in income. Yep. All right. So examples continued. Okay, I have a $30,000 salary, and my church gives me $1,000 a month of housing allowance, $12,000 total. How much am I paying in Social Security tax? I'm paying on $42,000 at a rate of 15.2%. That's not all that figures into Social Security. We'll get to that in a little bit. But as far as housing goes, that's the way that works. Okay, I have a $30,000 salary, and I live in a parsonage. And the fair rental value of that parsonage is considered to be $1,000 a month, total for the year, $12,000. How much am I paying in Social Security? $42,000. So it's the same answer again, right? So it doesn't matter whether the church is cutting you a check for $1,000 or if you're living in a parsonage. The fair rental value of that parsonage boosts the amount that you're going to pay Social Security tax on. Make sense? All right, opting out of Social Security, do we have, well, I shouldn't ask for a show of hands. Don't opt out. Just don't opt out if it's too late for most of you. If there's anyone who is just beginning the process of moving into ministry, you have that option. Don't exercise it. Don't opt out. Opting out is something that is available, but you have, and I am pretty explicit about it in the book, you have to be able to say that you conscientiously object to any kind of insurance, any welfare type of insurance. I mean, it's something that you just really, most of us can't say. I love the quote, I quoted it in the book, of Richard Hammer. He says, he's the clergy tax expert, he says, nobody other than Amish can pretty much say that you object morally to, yes?
Well, I don't opt out of it, but what if I did, because I was advised?
What it would involve is there's a form you file with the Internal Revenue Service saying you opt out.
Okay. But what's there saying
Why
why not to?
not to?
Like to take my income and spend it in stock market or any other area.
Sure. Well, for one thing, I mean, can you sign the form and sleep at night saying that you morally object to any form of health insurance or any other kind of insurance or anything that's and most of us can't say that because you participate in other things that are provided by the conference or the denomination. So that's, I think, answer number one. Number two, then, are you going to really be able to discipline yourself to sock away enough to provide the benefits that Social Security and Medicare are going to provide for you? Now, I know you can find any number of articles that are going to predict the doom and the gloom and the end of all of these systems, and maybe so. But on the other hand, that's kind of a big gamble. I had a conversation with actually a district superintendent out in Iowa a number of years ago who was feverishly trying to pick up the pieces on behalf of a handful of clergy in that annual conference, I think in his district, who had opted out. So seemed like a good idea in 1975 when they opted out. Now they're retiring, They haven't saved enough. And the conference doesn't want to be the bad guy. And, plus, I mean, your conference retirement is assuming there's a Social Security component and a Medicare component to it. So, which just advise not.
It was just a question.
No, it's a good question. It's a good, everybody's looking at it like, out of your mind. People do it. I mean, people do it. I don't know of a whole lot of Methodists anymore that do it, but I think there certainly are some denominations that do. All right. Any other questions? That was a good one, by the way. All right, we're going to keep going then.
Is there any word on the lawsuit about housing?
Yes, they had no standing, right? I think that was in November of 2000. The question was, is there any word on the lawsuit that was challenging the taxability of clergy, or the non-taxability of clergy housing? And the answer is yes. The court found that the, what was the group? Yeah, it was the Atheists. I mean, they have an actual name. No, it wasn't the ACLU. It's the Foundation Against Religious, I don't know, Foundation for Freedom from, it's Freedom from Religion. That's it. Freedom from Religion Foundation sued, saying that clergy get a benefit that no one else gets. And the court found that they lacked standing, which means they have no damages. They've never tried to get it and been denied it. So they've never filed a tax return claiming that they had the right to exclude housing and have that denied. And in order to file a suit, you have to have standing. That doesn't mean that's the end of it. I'm sure someone else will, somebody will get standing and they'll sue. There's no doubt. I mean, I think it's coming. But, I mean, I think we got to live with what we know, and what we know is this. So, fortunately, we'll keep hoping and praying. All right. I'm trying to think of what to skip. Nothing? Keep going? All right. All right. Parsonages are not taxable. So we know that. They're not taxable for federal income tax purposes. You know all that. You see that we've already talked about that. How much? That's a good question. How much can you exclude? And you know the answer to this because you all are good at this. How much can you exclude? The lesser of three things. What are they?
Actual amount spent and the amount designated as housing allowance.
Good grief. How are you all so smart?
The
book. That's it. That's it. You make me feel so good. All right. The Clergy Housing Allowance Clarification Act of 2002. That's the thing that was in response to Warren versus the Commissioner, Rick Warren, who tried to exclude a lot of housing. I mean, or a lot of his salary. Tried to maintain that. I mean, not a lot. 75% of his housing, or his salary was housing. So that was challenged. It led to like a threat through the process of it was working its way through the courts. It led to a threat. So Congress acted because Congress wanted to make sure that the courts wouldn't disqualify the housing allowance. So Congress acted in 2002 and put it into law. Because up till then, it was all more court cases that had decided these limits, and it wasn't codified. So now it is. So now it's in the tax code. So the lesser of these three is the amount that you can exclude, all right? So you know that every year at annual conference, you have an amount that you submit. You can do this amount if you're in a parsonage, in which case the amount is fairly small. And then, of course, if you're not in a parsonage, if you're owning your own home, your amount is larger, okay? That's referred to as the housing allowance. So, amount designated gets set up at annual conference. Charge conference, sorry, wrong word. Good point. I knew that. Charge conference, that's the amount designated. Amount actually used, that's the amount you actually spend. And then the annual fair rental value of the house. What is fair rental value? There you go. Ask an unrelated expert who compares property in question with other similar properties. Like if you have a realtor in your church, you can ask them, what would this house rent for if it's a parsonage? What would it, or another one that has been upheld in the tax court is you get the fair rental value of that home and multiply it times a reasonable rate of return. In other words, if somebody owned this house and wanted to rent it out, what would they expect to get back on it? And the tax court in a 1999 case used a 13% rate of return. Okay, so then if the house has $100,000 of a which is, that's very low, I realize. $100,000, let's just, because the math is easy. If a house has $100,000 fair rental value, or I'm sorry, market value, and you multiply that times 13%, then you can use a fair market, fair market value by multiplying those two numbers together, and then you're good to go. Yes?
My practice in structuring my compensation package has always been to overestimate
Yes.
what my housing costs will be and then declare what wasn't used when I file my return.
Couldn't agree more. Did you hear that? Loud and clear. In fact, I've got a slide on that later. That is smart planning, to over-designate. All right, so I got a bunch of examples. And I don't want to go through a bunch of examples. Well, okay, I'll show you one example. I've got a number of them, okay? And this is going to what you just said. Okay, let's say the church designates 13 of Pastor Kelly's compensation. She spends only 11, and the fair rental value of the home is determined to be 15. What does she do? She can only use 11. Now, the church is designated 13. So how do we handle that on the tax return? She only spends 11, so it's the lesser of those three. The smallest number up there is 11,000. 11 is all she can do and run through her tax return. How do I handle it, though? Because her W-2 shows an exclusion of 13. I got to add back. Since the church has reduced the amount reported on her W-2 by 13, she's going to have to add $2,000 back. But, like the comment in the back of the room, I'd rather be in that situation where I'm adding back, because maybe, and I have an example in a few minutes, I mean, I don't want to, we can go through as many of these as you want, but I'd rather be here where I'm adding back on the return than I had more that I spent that I couldn't I couldn't exclude from federal income tax because I under-designated. So good tax planning says to over-designate. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Should we do another one of these? Is this confusing? All right, here, let me go. Here's the last one. The church designates 13. She spends 16. Bad. Fair rental value is 15. So she spent 16. She could have shielded 16. No, she couldn't have. She could have shielded 15, but she under-designated. So what happens? Nothing happens on her tax return. She's got what she's got. She doesn't have to make any adjustment. Does that make sense? Because the lesser of the three is 13. I've got these outlined. Questions on that? Okay, I've got these outlined in the book, yeah. So over-designating is always the way to go, because all it's going to mean is that when your tax preparer, or you, if you're a brave soul, gets around to preparing that tax return at the end, if you've over-designated and you haven't spent enough, or you decide the fair rental value of the house is not really kind of what you thought it should have been when you designated, you just add it back. You would have paid on it anyway. But it's far better to be in that situation than to be kicking yourself and you didn't designate enough and the fair rental value was high enough and you spent it, but you can't shield that income. Does that make sense? This too, this is really important. You don't have to give the list to the church. I always get that question. Do I have to tell the church how much I spent on cleaning supplies and this, that, and the other thing? And the answer is no. This is between you and the IRS. You don't have to send anything in either. You just have to have it in your records should you ever be audited, which you hope will never happen, okay? And there's my last bullet point there. Good tax planning is to over-designate. All right, here we go. For clergy who own their own homes, actual expenses include, and notice the ones with the nice little asterisks because those are the ones we like the best. Mortgage interest payment. So what do we like best up here? Again, we like the mortgage interest payment and the real estate taxes. How come? Because we're double deducting them. I mean, if you own your own home, chances are you are itemizing. And if you're itemizing, that means you're taking a deduction for your real estate taxes and your mortgage interest. And how sweet is it to take a deduction for something that's not even an income? Yes. Never gets any better than that. That's like the best. So we love that. But you can also then deduct a down payment, your insurance, your utilities, and then all these other good things like furnishings, appliances, repairs, maintenance, and all things. The verbiage in the tax code is anything necessary to provide a home. So you can think pretty broadly on that. All right, if you are in a parsonage, yeah, you know, you don't own the house, so you're not making principal payments, you're not making interest payments, you're not paying real estate taxes, but you still can deduct some other things. So if you have insurance on the contents of that house, if the utilities aren't covered by the church, which they usually are, furnishings, appliances, repairs, maintenance, and anything necessary to provide a home. And I hopefully that is clear to everybody. I mean, if you're in a parsonage, this still applies to you. You can designate a portion of your cash salary as housing. It's typically fairly low because you're in a house that's already provided. So, you know, what do you really have to spend money on? Well, these kinds of things here. Right. Yeah, if you're refurnishing, this is a great time to buy furniture. Yeah, I mean, really. Yeah, you know, and do plan it that way. I sure used to. I used to think, okay, you know, it's getting close to the end of the year. I don't want to buy that now. I'll buy it in the next year and make sure. You know, you can time things. There's a lot of creative things you can do. The question is, what does the pension calculation hinge on? It's total compensation, correct? I mean, I'm looking to people in the room that know something about how the pension, I thought so, right? Doesn't it all get added back in? I mean, all we're doing is we're monkeying around with things so that we can squeak our way through the Internal Revenue Code to get you in the position where you can pay as little federal income tax. That's the only thing we're doing here. Now, you got the conference over here who's computing your pension on numbers. I don't think this has anything to do with that. All it is trying to finesse it so that you comply, in my mind at least, with the federal tax law. All right, Social Security then. You're considered self-employed, you know that. You're paying twice the rate, approximately 15%. And the correct computation of the taxable Social Security base is critical. And this is probably where I think I've seen more errors in individual income taxes being prepared than anything else, is the fact that this part's not done right. And this part is crucial. So, what gets included in the Social Security base? Well, wages from your W-2. Now, what about those wages on your W-2? Oh, that's right. They're reduced, aren't they? They're reduced by your housing because you told the church you're going to designate a certain amount as housing. So the wages on the W-2 don't include the housing. So if you're in a parsonage, you add that. If you're not in a parsonage, you're owning your own home and you have a housing allowance, you add that. Does that make sense? Sure. To the W-2.
It's called other income.
Well, no, this is just in a little side calculation that you're going to do to try to come up with the amount that, well, yeah, it's actually, I mean, you don't have to fill out the whole, it's not on the W-2. I'm sorry, it's not on the page 1 of the 1040. This is on the computation of self-employment income, Schedule SE, which it flows through to the big, let me stress, big amount of Social Security tax that you're going to pay on page 2 of the 1040, okay? Now, you can, another line in here, and I don't have it and I should, would be if you get any honoraria from weddings, funerals, if you do anything else where somebody slips you money and pays you, that goes in here as well. That usually goes on a Schedule C, but that Schedule C is going to, all those numbers are going to come together into this one great calculation of the amount of Social Security tax that you owe, okay? Now, you can reduce it by any unreimbursed business expense. Unreimbursed business expense. So, if your church doesn't pay all your mileage when you're driving back and forth to the hospital, and your church doesn't pay for the various and sundry things you buy to keep things going in the church, you can reduce the amount of Social Security tax and the base that you're going to pay tax on by unreimbursed. Now, if they're paying them, if the church is paying them, you can't reduce your base for that. But if the church doesn't pay or doesn't pay you enough, doesn't pay all of them, you can reduce it, the base, okay? So what is this number again? It's that bottom line number that you're then going to take and multiply times 0.9235 times 0.153. So about 15.3%. It's a little bit less because there's a slight calculation you do prior to 15.3. So you want to get this number as low as you can, but it seems like everything you do is adding it and making it higher and higher. Okay, so you start with the W-2, you add back the housing, you add back anything else that you're paid in the course of doing the job that you do, your employment, and then maybe take off a little bit of unreimbursed if you've got some. You shouldn't have many We'll get to that in a little bit. You shouldn't have many unreimbursed. Your church should be paying your business expenses. Yes?
So for old fogies who still have a newspaper subscription,
Yes.
that's a legitimate unreimbursed business.
Last I read. Yep. Last I read. Yeah, those books. That was the one time. See, I'd yell at them for spending so much money on books, and then I'd be like, well, but at least your Social Security base is a little bit lower. It didn't get them off the hook for very long. Does this make sense? Does this sort of make sense? It's awful confusing. It truly is. Yeah. All right.
Isn't there a line on the 1040 form where you put back half of what you paid?
Yep. That helps. That helps. Yeah, there's an adjustment down at the bottom of the front page of the 1040. There's an adjustment to income, and you're going to subtract out half of your Social Security tax. That hasn't been around all that long. That's been about 6, 7, 8 years they've done that. Maybe a little longer. All right, withholding. We had a question on this a few minutes ago, so we'll come back to that. Is your church required to withhold on you? Answer is no. No. They can if they're nice and if they want to help you out, and if they already have non-clergy people on the payroll that they're already having to mess around with filing payroll tax returns for and doing estimated payments on. They can. But as was pointed out, they are not withholding Social Security on you. It is not Social Security. They are not designating it as that. All they're doing is they're doing you a favor by pulling out some money out of your check and sending it off to the Internal Revenue Service for you. That's all they're doing. At the end of the year, you square it all up with the IRS on the second page of your tax return, and all that they've withheld comes in on the amount withheld, and then that amount has to be enough to cover what? Both federal tax and Social Security Medicare tax, right? So if you have enough in there, you get a refund. If you don't have enough in there, you have to pay, okay? They do not have to, but you can ask them to. Otherwise, you got to make quarterly tax payments. I've got the dates up here. Yeah, April 15th, June 15th, approximately, September 15th, and January 15th. So if you expect to owe at least $1,000, there's a little bit of a safe harbor where you can be protected from penalty if you've paid in 100% of the prior year's return or prior year's tax and so forth. Anyway, that has to get filed. So if your church isn't willing to or able to withhold on you, you got to make estimated tax payments. How many of you make estimated tax payments? Yeah, a lot of you, so you know the drill. And if you have a good tax preparer, the tax preparer will send you reminders, send you the coupons, set you up for automatic withdrawal. So in the first church that Phil served, he was an associate, gets a call from another guy who's an associate on staff, whose wife had just found out, they had just found out the wife was pregnant. Was it April 1st? I don't know, maybe April 12th? Phil, what's this about estimated taxes? He was appointed in June, wasn't he? July. What's this about estimated taxes? Am I supposed to be paying in estimates? Just clueless. So you don't want to be there in that situation. Look out for those around you who are new, that don't know this kind of stuff. You know, I don't know that the information is always provided in a way that it should. Any questions on estimates? Yes?
If you shift from paying estimated to having the church withhold, does that raise any red flags?
Not that I'm aware of. You know, another thing too, if you have a spouse that works, just have it more taken out of the spouse's check, as long as you file jointly. I mean, yeah. Well, it is a good idea. It works fine. I mean, you have to stay married, and you have to file jointly for it to work. But if you intend to stay married and file jointly at the end of the year, you know, it all is commingled at the end of the year. IRS doesn't care if it came out of her check or if you sent it in. That doesn't work then. Yeah, obviously, if you're both clergy. Yeah. Yes.
Question: if you have a church that's nice and wants to, as a normal employer would, pay their portion of that S&E tax,
They can do it.
they can do it, but through the payroll.
They can do it, but all they're doing is paying you extra pay on which you're going to pay tax.
Okay.
So what it is they would say, yeah, you know, this is tough because this is how much you're going to get nailed with tax. That would have been our responsibility, half of it. So we'll give you that extra.
Or they can deduct it. So instead of adding it on, you can just subtract it below that period. So instead of saying 30,000, 7.5 is what's gonna be added, so you're
Yeah.
still less tax.
Yeah, I mean, but it's taxable income to you. Yeah, no getting around it, unfortunately. It's just additional compensation. All right. Honorary and gifts, we know that. All love offerings, gifts, bonuses are taxable income, weddings and funerals, and typically you flow those through a Schedule C. So if you have any expenses that specifically relate to those, you can take them against that on a Schedule C. Schedule C is what most people that are self-employed file. You don't, because you're not self-employed for income tax purposes. But everyone else who's self-employed for income tax purposes files a Schedule C. Yes?
Christmas gifts. So if it flows through the church, it's taxable income.
Yeah.
If it goes to the chair at SPRC and they give you their personal check, it's not taxable.
Probably, it's kind of a de minimis thing too. I think if it's, no. I mean, technically, the real answer is probably that, it's paid to you because of services you performed, and that's a work relationship. I mean, but an individual can give an individual a gift without tax consequences as long as it's below gift tax limits, which is about $13,000. Is it about $13,000 now, I still think? Yeah, something like that. So, I mean, if an individual gives you $100 in a Christmas card, there's no tax consequences to that. But if it is considered a gift from the church, yes?
So, for example, and I've been raising this question for a while, and I've had different answers. So, we bring in guest ministers and things like that, and we compensate them. In my context, the norm is we take up an offering as per preachers, and we put that money in an envelope,
Yeah.
and that money can go out your way.
Yeah.
But should we be writing checks for that? Should we be on W-9?
1099s? 1099s, yeah. Technically, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Is it 300 now? Is it 300 now, I think? Crazy. Don't you just love regulation? Yeah, it's getting worse. It's getting tighter. The regulation is tightening as the IRS attempts to regulate, untaxed portions of the economy, and that's one. So what about structuring the compensation package? And how about two? If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Not that I'll always know the answers, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions on tax. How do you structure the compensation package? I think it's good to we'll look at 5 things here. One is educational debt, which is going to apply to some of you, not to others, so we can go kind of quickly through that. Strategic use of housing. We'll talk about that. Medical, there isn't much to say, really, because you have medical benefits. I mean, it's much more of a something to discuss with a group of clergy that weren't United Methodists, perhaps. Retirement is also, you got a good deal. Expense reimbursement. We'll talk a little bit about that one. So first, education debt. I do think, though, that overall, just to take a step back on the full topic, if you can have an open conversation about compensation, I think that's a good thing. I think that helps to reduce some of the anxiety that surrounds money. So we'll start by just throwing that out there. All right, what about educational debt? How many in the room does this apply to? You're coming out with some debt? All right, we'll go kind of quickly then, because it doesn't appear to be that many of you. Basic rule of thumb, and this is not me, this is the Auburn Seminary Foundation that does a lot of work in the area of seminary debt. They say that no more than 8% of your income should be committed to repaying seminary debt. Okay, no more than 8%. Well, what does that mean then? If you've got a monthly loan payment of $250, then you need $37,500 to support that. So what's the math on that? Take that $250 monthly student loan payment, multiply it times 12 to get it annualized, and then divide it by 8%. That's how you would come up with the amount of salary that you're going to need by their guidelines. It's not my guidelines, it's their guidelines, that you really wouldn't want to devote much more than 8% of your compensation to student loans. Okay? Yes?
Now, what you didn't suggest, or they didn't suggest, is how much, or how do you determine what your monthly loan payment should be? As far as, is that based off of, I guess what's that based on?
Basically a 10-year term.
Whatever your negotiated I mean, you have an exit interview, right, when you're finishing up, at which point in time you sign your loan documents and you agree to a repayment plan. So your question is, what should the terms of that be?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
like do you say, okay, I'm gonna try to pay my loan off in 20 years?
Gotcha.
Or do you say, well, I know I have 20 years to pay this, but I don't want to be paying it for 20 years. I want to
Absolutely.
get it done in 5.
I think the answer to that is you pay it off as quickly as you possibly can. But can you, yes, can you do it? That's right. Can you do it based on this? And that's the big if. Are you going to have enough income to support that? But yeah, I mean, all you got to do, if you can run numbers on this and compute the amount of, you could ask them to do it, compute the amount of interest you're going to pay if you pay it off in 5 years and compare that to the total amount of interest that you're going to pay if you pay it off in 20 years. It's breathtaking, the difference. So obviously, I mean, you want to pay it off as quickly as you can, but you have to put food on the table and you have to be able to live. So this, I mean, it's a matter of choices. Anybody else weigh in on that? Yes?
I was just going to say that your advice can change over time.
Sure.
I remember in 1998, I was getting 5.5% in the savings account.
Yeah.
At that point, the loans for education were at about 4.5%.
The good old days.
With the tax benefit, it was better
Yep.
not to pay it off.
Yes.
After seminary,
Good point.
it was the other. It was now we're getting 0.75.
Yep.
It was 7%. So
Yep.
we wanted to pay it off as soon as possible.
Yes.
So it did change.
Absolutely. You're very, very good point. Very good point. Yeah. Then the one recommendation, and I don't think I'm going to go into this in much depth here, but one recommendation that I do make in this chapter, that section of the chapter 9 in the book, is that I don't think that it's out of line at all for you in a conversation related to compensation to talk to the church about the fact that they're not paying you enough to comply with this 8% rule of thumb, and to basically ask for more, and to compute really what the salary would, and you don't expect them necessarily to pick up the whole difference. I think the example I use is, maybe the salary they're paying you is enough to support a $200 a month payment, and your payment is $275. Can you go to the church and say, hey, I would like to request, good luck, I know, but I'd like to request, I think you have grounds to at least have that conversation and say, you're the beneficiary of my seminary education. Seminary education is probably within the mission of this church, right? And most churches would say, yeah, they're reasonably interested in educating students to go on into pastoral ministry. That's certainly, it's not like you're asking them to do something crazy. Would they be interested? Would they be willing? Maybe if they can't do, and to tell them what your debt is. Do they even know what your debt is? Tell them about this 8% rule of thumb. Tell them that you really, in order to comply with that, you'd need this much more. I'm not going to ask for that, but, would you all be willing? I'm $75 a month short based on this rule of thumb. Would you help me out? Would you pay me $50 more? Now, that's going to be taxable income to you. It's just, it's like a raise. But I guess I would like to empower you to have that conversation, to be able to think about that as you think about compensation planning. Yes?
Is this annual salary or total compensation? In other words, does that annual salary include parsonage or include?
Yeah, that's always a really good question. The parsonage, in a sense, doesn't give you cash. I mean, it reduces your overall living expenses, but it doesn't give you the cash in order to be able to make the housing pay, or to be able to make the loan payment. I believe that when they, so you're asking on the Auburn study. That's a good question. What did the Auburn study say? I want to say it was cash compensation, but I don't know. If you want me to check that, I can. That's worth it. That'll be tickling around in my mind. I don't know. I've never been asked that question before, and I can't remember because it's been a while since I've read that. Anything else? Yes?
I think I know the answer.
Oh, please.
Shelter,
Say again?
shelter, salary, take reduction in salary, and have the church pay
Yes.
the whole amount?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Could we reduce the amount of salary I'm taking and have the church pay my loan?
Sure.
And shelter that
Oh.
income for the
For tax purposes. Probably not, because it's compensation. It's compensation to you, I think. I like that idea, too. I like that idea. I don't know.
I mean, in principle, what would the difference be between that and the church paying a scholarship?
Good question. I love that idea, and I don't know, but I'm going to go look that up and see if I can get an angle on that. So the question is, could the church make the loan payment? Have you looked at this some for the foundation? Was there tax consequences? No, but you're just renegotiating.
No, that's a different.
That's a different thing. I mean, Phil's looking at, yeah. I don't know. Boy, the IRS just considers everything income. So my hunch is they'd consider it income, but they may not. And that's really, boy, that'd be neat, wouldn't it? Just have them make the payment. All right, good question, and I will look it up. All right, I'm going to zip through the rest of this educational debt stuff because I don't think there's anything much more to be added here. And move forward to strategic use of housing. All right, is that okay? So owning your own home is always better, nearly always. I shouldn't say always, nothing is always. Is almost always better than living in a parsonage, barring economic downturn. And I tell the story in the book about when we first took our first appointment. It would have been ridiculous for us to buy a home. We were in the church about 2.5 years in an extremely affluent area on the west side of Cleveland. It just would have made no sense for us to have bought a home. So there certainly are circumstances where buying a home is not a good idea. However, owning a home for tax purposes is certainly advantageous. And then, as we know, for a variety of other reasons as well. The opportunity, of course, to build up equity is a major, major benefit of home ownership. So when the church owns the home, the parsonage, it's the church that's building up the equity, true? And you're the one without any equity if you stay in that church for a number of years and then leave. So what are some options? Well, potentially the church might be able to rent out the parsonage and use the cash from the rent to provide a housing allowance to you. That is a possibility, something worth considering. Because again, we're talking about advantageous ways to structure a compensation package. So if you're in conversation with the church before you accept the appointment and make the move, and they're wanting to put you in a parsonage, and you feel that you'd be better served by your own home, this is something to consider. Another option, could the church sell the parsonage and use the investment income? Anybody in a situation where that has taken place, or either one of these two? Yeah. These aren't uncommon things, where the church will rent out the house, the parsonage, or the church will sell the parsonage, put the money into a fund, and then use the proceeds at least to partially compensate the clergy. There are some that would suggest that in lieu of, if the pastor lives in a parsonage, in lieu of that the pastor should be paid some type of equity allowance to compensate for the fact that they aren't building up equity. Insurance, medical reimbursement, you've got great health insurance, well, I think reasonably good health insurance. I shouldn't speak for the conference itself. I know in Tennessee the conference health plan is good. None of this is unique to clergy. So let me just pop that up there and see if there are any questions. I do think it's very smart to take advantage of any kind of medical reimbursement plan that you can take advantage of. That's where you set aside and pay your tax or your medical expenses that, your out-of-pocket medical expenses, you pay them with money that's never been taxed. That's always a smart thing to do. Those have different names. Sometimes they're cafeteria plans, Section 125 plans. There's a variety of ways those are described, but I'm sure you've got one. If you're not participating in that, that's a smart thing to participate in because you're going to be paying with money that's never been taxed. Retirement contributions. The only thing I would say here is if for some reason you're not participating, and I should have looked up what the rules are for, matching. So you can tell me you contribute and the conference contributes. True? No. Church does? Yeah? Local church? So, okay. So there is no debate. It's not their contribution is not based on yours? Okay. So we can just skip this. Okay. Oh, there is. All right. If you put in
PMP
yes.
has started the new thing.
Okay.
If you contribute 2%, they'll match 1% to that,
okay.
and then you can over and above you can go beyond.
Okay. All right. So there is a 2%, 1%. All right. I thought so, but I didn't want to misspeak. I guess my only, and I say this in the book, my only advice there is, if there's a match, and you're not putting in your portion in order to get that match, you're never going to get that money back. I mean, it's gone. You have a one-time opportunity. Now, if it's 1%, it's not that much, and you have to put in 2% yourself to get it. You know, you might say to yourself, okay, it's not a big deal. I mean, there are some plans where it's 5% and 5% or 6% and 6%. So typically the advice I give to people when they're thinking about, you know, especially younger folks starting out, and have this conversation with college students all the time. If you get to participate in a 401k or a 403b or whatever it might be, you better do it, because if there's that match, you're never going to ever recover that money that your employer was willing to match. It's never going to be available to you again. And early, you know, starting early as far as growing money towards retirement is obviously the way to go. Okay? Any questions on that? I don't think it's a big issue here for us. All right. I want to spend a little bit of time, and I'm going to skip through a few slides, and you can do these on your own as far as if you want to know more. Do you want to talk a little bit about church-related expense reimbursements? So I'm kind of watching the time. Am I out of time? All right. 20. That's amazing. All right, we got time. I want to spend a little bit of time then, of course, on church-related expense reimbursement, because I think this is an important issue, and my hunch is this applies to everybody. The idea that there are expenses related to doing your job, and those are church expenses. Those are not personal expenses. So I even hesitate to talk about them in the context of compensation, because in my mind, they are not compensation. And they don't really belong here, but this is a good place to talk about them, okay? So I want to say that again. This is not a compensation issue. Why? Because they're not your expenses. They're the church's expenses. That's easy to say. It's sometimes difficult to convince the church of that, isn't it? Amen. Yeah, and I would take it, Yep, I would take real exception to that, and I think that is the common understanding. So, these rules that we're going to discuss here, you probably know very well. They are not unique to clergy. That's good, because that means the people sitting on your staff parish committee probably have the same rules at the places they work. This is nothing unique, unlike all that crazy income tax and Social Security tax stuff. That's exclusively clergy. This is not. This is true for anybody that works anywhere, all right? So you need a written accountable reimbursement plan, and without that kind of a plan, anything paid to you then is indeed compensation. Does that make sense? So with a written accountable plan, the church pays the church's expenses. To have you go to the hospital, to have you take people out to lunch, to have you buy books, to have you buy supplies, to have you buy whatever it is that is necessary to do your job, okay? And the IRS lingo here is ordinary and necessary. So if anything that's an ordinary expense for anyone doing your job, or a necessary expense, doesn't have to be required to be necessary. Okay, so it's not like the IRS, or it's not like the church has to require you to get a certain, you know, whatever in order to do the job, a certain computer to do the job, or whatever it would be. It has to be ordinary and necessary, okay? So I do encourage you to start to maybe make that shift in thinking that these are not my business expenses. These are the church's expenses. If you go to a conference that the church wants you to go to, that's the church expense. And the church really ought to pay that. At least I would maintain that. Now, getting them to do that is a whole other thing. Yes?
So what about some tangible object, like a book or a computer? Now, if the church doesn't really own that, they're not going to...
There is kind of a fine line. And I describe that in the book as well. Let's say you meet and take your board chair to lunch. Is there a tangible benefit from going to lunch in order to be able to discuss the meeting that night? Is there a tangible benefit from going to lunch? Yeah. You leave there with your stomach full. Is there a benefit, though, to the church? Yeah, because the meeting that evening is going to go better because you took the time to meet with that person in order to go through the meeting agenda. So I would maintain, and so does the IRS, that that's a business expense. That's a legitimate business expense for Internal Revenue Service purposes. As long as you note who the meal was with and what the business purpose of that meal was, that's an ordinary and necessary expense. Yes?
In the negotiations with my staff parish, we put together a written statement of understanding of what is and isn't acceptable use of the accountable reimbursement.
Yeah.
And in our case, where we came down was anything over $300 in value, computers or
Yep.
whatever, where the church's property depreciated over 3 years, and in the 3 years they become my property. If there's a change of employment anywhere in between, it's prorated.
Sounds reasonable. Sounds reasonable, yes.
So I got a new appointment, and the conference, quote unquote, paid for my relocation, but I got an extra W-2 from in the mail for like $2,500. That was really adding that as wage compensation for me. So how'd they pay for it?
Anybody go through that recently? I heard some yes indeeds over here. And how did you handle that on your tax return?
I don't know, I gave it to my accountant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I went lunch 10 years ago, and it was income.
Okay.
Right. It was income to me. I
Okay.
had to report it.
Okay.
I think it has something to do with how far.
It does. There's a whole set of requirements.
So my move was over 60 miles.
Okay.
And what I understood, the cutoff point was 50 or 51 miles.
Okay, I haven't looked at the rules
What
lately.
they did was they calculated from my home to the church and from the church to my new home.
Okay.
Which they said, okay, this is my.
And so then the amount that appeared on a W-2 was more than they had actually paid you for the move. They didn't put the whole amount on the W-2, did they? Or did they? Whole amount.
I
Okay.
can't see the move costing them more
Okay.
than $2,500.
Okay. Because my understanding is then that you can offset that by the expenses that you incurred. Yeah. So
See, they pay the bill.
they pay it entirely.
Yeah, but then it's considered.
It's considered income, and all of it's considered income. Okay, because you must not have it. It must be the mileage thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And they're expensive. And
See, I haven't looked at that in a while, I have to say, to know 100%. Yeah, talk to your tax advisor and see what they say. I mean, I would like to think, but it could be that they've already computed in there any amount that is not taxable, and this is the excess and it is taxable, or that none of it's going to be, that all of it's going to be taxable because of the amount of, or the mileage and the move. Yeah. Boy, didn't see that one coming, huh? Seemed like a great benefit. All right, anything else on this slide here? We'll move forward. Yes. For it to be an accountable reimbursement plan, then, the expense has to have a church connection. So it can't just be anything. It has to have a church connection. You have to adequately account to the church. If the church gives you more money than the expense was, you got to give the excess back in 120 days. And reimbursement comes out of church funds. It doesn't reduce salary. It's not a salary reduction. You don't fund it through salary reduction. All right, so what's this mean then? I think I have another slide. Well, let me say a couple things here. Okay. This is where you do keep a list of things. We said with the parsonage expenses, you don't. That's between you and the IRS in the event you ever are audited. Here, that's not the case. You're going to actually submit bills. Church looks at them. Church pays you back. We get into dicey areas if they say, oh, we're going to give you $200 a month for business expenses under an accountable plan. Well, what if there's a month you don't spend $200? Well, it depends. You can still comply and have an accountable plan if you do it right. Part of the right is that third bullet where you're going to give back any excess. So if they give you $200 a month and you only spend $75 one month, you have to give that back within 120 days. That's not the cleanest way to do it. The best way is to turn in your bills and get the check from them, okay? And then not funded by salary reduction. What happens if you don't have a plan? What if the church just says, no, sorry, pastor, you're on your own. Not paying any of your expenses.
Item
take it off your tax return. Can't really do it on a Schedule C because you don't have any income to go against it. Yeah, it's going to be an itemized deduction on Schedule A. But don't forget, you have to prorate the expense. You can't take 100% of it. Why? Because not all of 100% of your income is taxable for federal purposes. So if you've got 25% of your compensation is housing and 75% is not, then only 75% of the expense is going to flow through. Okay? And then in addition, you get hit with another Schedule A like everyone else. That piece I just described is unique to clergy. But like everybody else on Schedule A, you're only going to be able to deduct what is in excess of 2% of adjusted gross income. So that's not the best way to do it. That is not the best way to do it. You want to get reimbursed by the church, okay? If they reimburse part of it, not all of it, then you can flow the rest of it through Schedule A. Schedule A is just itemized deductions. You can flow the rest through. But that you're going to face that prorating again. Don't forget the prorating. Yes?
I was just saying, one of the advantages of being a conference employee as district superintendent, all of your expenses were taken care of.
Fabulous.
But
And they should be.
The reality is, when
And
you
they
go
should be.
back to the local church, especially a smaller
They
church,
don't do it.
doesn't happen.
I know it.
What I have found is, I submit to the little small church who has a budget item of only $2,000 reimbursement. I submit everything.
All of it.
They don't pay.
Nope.
But then I have records of
Yep.
unreimbursed
Yep.
clergy business.
That's right. So then you have it for your individual tax return. You also then are presenting to the church a better picture of what it actually costs to operate the church if they couldn't rely on the pastor to underwrite a lot of the expenses of the church. And that's exactly what is happening, right? And it's not right. It's not fair. And I think you need, that's why I included here with compensation, because I think you need to tell them that. I mean, you're going to do it in a tactful way, and you're going to be gracious in the way you do it, but I think that's a conversation that needs to take place. They need to recognize the fact that you are helping them balance the budget because you are paying this much, and if you've documented it for the prior year, hey, last year I paid, $1,500 of church expenses out of my own pocket. Just so you know, just saying. Yes?
So I always expense them on Schedule C and there's a loss. Tell me why that's wrong.
Because they are considered, like anybody else, they're considered unreimbursed business expense, and unreimbursed business expenses go on Schedule A, subject to the 2% reduction a 2% of adjusted gross income reduction, and now, since you're clergy, the prorated portion of your income. That's a part that gets missed a lot, that prorated thing.
But these can come off of your Social Security base.
The whole thing.
The whole thing.
The whole thing.
And so what I have found is that many times I don't meet the federal requirement or whatever.
Yeah.
But it reduces
Do it.
the Social Security.
Exactly.
And also, the state and county, for taxes for state and county, often accept the full thing.
There you go. Depending
rather
on
than just the,
depending on the state you're in, or you move to Tennessee and you don't pay any state income tax. Love that. That is a nice thing about living in Tennessee. All right, what was just said here is a very important point, that you're going to use this calculation two places of your unreimbursed business expense. Okay, our hope is this is zero, because in a perfect world, the church would pay 100%, but we know they don't, right? So let's say you get to the end of the year and there's $1,200 that the church hasn't paid, okay? Because it's just, you've spent more than the church is able to pay, all right. That $1,200 you're going to use two places. The first place you're going to use it at 100% is on the computation of that Social Security wage base. And that's the number we want to get as low as we can. So we're glad we can take 100%. So it is worth tracking these. Even if you don't itemize deductions, you still can use that information on that Social Security wage base reduction. If you do itemize deductions, you live in your own home, you've got your Schedule A going, you got your contributions, you got everything. The very bottom section of the Schedule A is miscellaneous stuff, and that's where unreimbursed, you have to do a Form 2106 is the form. That's the part that's tricky on TurboTaxes to get that through, I think, because it wants to put it there. So you may not be able to get anything of value on Schedule A itemized deductions, but it's still worth doing because it's going to reduce that Social Security wage base. Is that good? Crystal clear, right? Sorry, I know. I think TurboTax is smart enough to do the proration now. I think it knows that. Yeah, they have improved. I think I was kind of shocked at that. I'm like, whoa.
Particular point where you identify yourself as clerk.
Yes.
It just opens up an entire.
Yes, it does. And then it's smart enough to know, okay, they said this was housing back at the early interview stage, one of the first pages. They said this was housing. They said this is their W-2. So the proportion of those two together, they're going to prorate on Schedule A. It's pretty crazy. It does pretty well. All right. Any final questions? We've got maybe, how much time? 5 minutes. I think a good thing for you to do, and what I'd ask you to do in the 5 minutes before we take a break, is to turn to the people at your table who are in your mentor group and talk to them. Because you might have somebody at your table who is just about ready to look for a tall bridge to jump off of, or thinking seriously about moving into another line of work. And you need to talk them off the ledge, okay? You're going to be there for them, and you're going to try to help them. And you get some pretty smart people out here at tables that have dealt with this a lot of years.